Well, welcome once again to the winter wonderland, another snowstorm and another lens review for you. And I'm here today to do my definitive review of the Fujinon XF. This is the 50mm F1.0. This is their F1 lens, and it is for those that are looking for a very large aperture 50mm lens, which in this case is a 76mm full frame equivalent. So a little bit of maybe an oddball of a focal length, certainly not the traditional 85mm equivalent, but this is a lens that of course will be very appealing to some portrait photographers that are looking for something unique to shoot their portraits with. Now, of course, today we're doing the definitive review, and so we'll be taking some time, adding a lot of detail. If you want a faster review, you can check out the standard review, and it'll give you the highlights without all of the details along the way. But today we're going to start by jumping in and taking a look at the build and the handling. So the first thing that stands out to you, of course, is that this is a very large lens, particularly for the Fuji system. This is the new XS10 body. And so it's obviously not the largest, most robust, of the various Fuji bodies that are out there. But even if you had this on like an X-T4, it's still going to be a large lens on that kind of setting. And so just to give you a little bit of context, here's the 50mm f2, which has been their kind of common 50mm lens, and so obviously a huge amount of difference. And here's the 56mm f1.4 from Viltrox, an autofocus alternative here. And so, what we have got here is a really, a significant lens. This is 845 grams, almost 2 pounds worth of lens, compared to 200 grams or 290 grams. And so we literally have over 4 times as heavy as this lens and almost 3 times as heavy as the Viltrox. So this is a large lens. It is 103.5 millimeters in overall length. And so that compares to right under 60 millimeters and 72 millimeters. And then the diameter is also large at 87 millimeters compared to 60 millimeters and 65 millimeters. That also causes you to end up with obviously a larger 77 millimeter front filter thread, and so, which is not a big deal. 77 millimeters is a nice common, filter size, but obviously this is it's a significant lens. It's going to feel a little bit front heavy. There's a lot of glass in there, and a lot of glass that's located, right out here. And so anyway, it's not going to be the world's best balance on a lot of these Fuji bodies because of its overall size. But what you do have is a very nice premium grade of build, and so you've got a lot of metal in the construction. The aperture ring has nice detents in it, and then moves over into auto if you prefer to not use the aperture ring, and so that all feels nice. The focus ring is also nicely damped. There are no switches or anything on the barrel. It's a pretty straightforward lens, so not even an AF/MF switch. You're going to have to control that from within the body. And it's in moments like this that I do miss, like from the XT series, the front selector that allows you to do that a little bit more quickly. But anyway, and so no switches on the barrel. The lens hood itself is, you have to really push past the first resistance to lock it in good. So it locks fine after that. But it's plasticky. It's it's nothing special for sure. Particularly when you consider like the cheap Viltrox has a nice metal lens hood that matches the little the metal construction in the frame. So anyway, it just seems a little bit of a cheap out on a lens that's $1,500 US. Beyond that, we've got 9 rounded aperture blades inside. We do have a weather sealing on the lens itself. And so that begins with a nice gasket here at the lens mount. There are a total of 11 seal points throughout the lens itself. So a nice degree of weather sealing there, which obviously is great to have. So one of the downsides of this particular design is that your minimum focus distance is only 70 centimeters. Or 2.3 feet, which is obviously not very close at all. And so that gives you a really low, actually one of the lowest figures that I've seen, a 0.08 times magnification, which is not much magnification at all. It's almost half of the 0.15 magnification you get with the 50mm f2. And the Viltrox is not great, but it's better, giving you 0.10 times. So a really low degree of magnification. So, I mean, overall, I mean, there's pros and cons here. This is a large lens. It's a heavy lens. It does have a nice degree of build, however. You're gonna have to determine whether or not, that's really what you are looking for. This is a lens that is big, it is heavy, and it is expensive. Now, it is also nicely built. It operates just fine. However, outside of having an aperture ring, there isn't a whole lot going on in terms of bells and whistles, certainly not any kind of image stabilization or anything like that. So if you have one of the newer cameras that has, IBIS in the camera, then you have some stabilization. Outside of that, you're without any kind of stabilization as a part of it. We do get nice weather sealing, but nothing here in terms of, options to declick the aperture or even an AF/MF switch. And so, it's kind of surprisingly bare bones for a lens that retails for $1,500 US. And so I would only give it a okay grade when it comes to build and handling, because while it is, it is a nice lens, it's nicely made, it does have weather sealing, for that kind of money, there's not a whole lot of features here. And of course, it is going to be large and bulky for a lot of people. And as I note, for example, on this XS10 body, there's really not a lot of room because it's a pretty wide lens, particularly when I've got little gloves on. I can barely fit my fingers in there on the grip. And so I don't necessarily love the handling of the lens itself. Now, when it comes to the autofocus performance, this is another place where I'm less than delighted. Let's just leave it at that. They actually, which is surprising to me, they utilize their DC motors rather than, employing like multi-linear motors to give us a faster, smoother, quieter autofocus performance. I have seen that Fuji is capable of better. For example, on their top tier 20mm or 200mm f2, I should say, autofocus was amazing on that, even though it's having very large elements. Even the 90mm f2 has, fairly good quiet autofocus. In this case, the DC motor means that our autofocus is only okay. Focus speed is okay. Our actual sound involved is okay. I mean, it's not slow, and so I'll give them this. I mean, I reviewed, for example, years ago, I reviewed the Canon EF 50mm F1.0, and it's not a particularly impressive optical lens. You really have to use it to its strengths to get much of anything great out of it. And so it's definitely an improvement on that in terms of focus speed, because the focus speed is not bad, but what you will find is that it gets most of the way there fairly quick, and then there's a fine-tuning phase that takes place at the end. And so autofocus it works okay for like portrait type work. IAF, it worked fine, and it would lock in on the eye and did a fairly good job for that. Without a person in the frame, I actually don't like Fuji's autofocus nearly as much. It's not as intuitive of just kind of getting anything sampling from across the frame, and so you have to do a lot more of moving a box around to the area where you want. The other platforms I review, Canon and Sony, I just find their focus systems more intuitive to use than what I do Fuji. But the autofocus it gets the job done, but it's not going to be anyone's favorite lens when it comes to focus, and that's even more true when you talk about the performance for focus pulls. Let's take a look at that. And so, as you can see, it's a little bit rough there. There's there's definitely some noise involved in focus, and you can just see that bit of settling, and also you can see some obvious stepping if you're making a major focus change. There's kind of a one step and then a second step to arrive at the destination. And so autofocus is not particularly impressive to me. I think that if they would have gone where they employed 2 or 3 linear motors, you could have gotten a quieter and smoother autofocus performance. So not quite sure why they went to the more primitive DC motor in this situation. So how about the image quality? This is really the primary reason why a person would invest in a big, heavy, expensive lens like this. So let's see if it lives up to its cost expectations. Let's jump in and take a look. So let's start off with distortion and vignette. You can see the mildest amount of pincushion distortion that's there, and some vignette that is fairly concentrated into the corners. And you can see the extreme corners are quite dark relative to, say, the mid-frame. So your standard profile, it kind of compromises by, correcting the corners a little bit less, and so it gives you a fairly even performance elsewhere. Now here's a look at a manual correction. You can see that I corrected a little bit more in the corners. I added a plus 60 into the corners and then spread the midpoint out to bring it out into the center, and about a minus 2 in correcting the pincushion distortion. So not much in the pincushion, the distortion area, and you get a nice clean end result. No real problem there. And vignette is, just, slightly more of an issue. Several stops in the corner. So here's a look at the chart. Now, just to give you the information here, we're using the XS10 body for this test, and so that does have the same 26 megapixel X-Trans sensor that you'll find in, say, the XT4. And so we can see that, and this is at 200%, which is the level that I look at these. So you can see that at, this kind of examination level, contrast is really quite low, even in the center of the frame. Same is true here. There is some, detail there, but contrast is low. There's actually a fairly even performance out towards the edges. It's not like it falls apart out here until you get out into the very extreme. However, you can also see that it's, contrast is really quite low here. Now we can see that there is a bit of lateral chromatic aberration in our, black lines here, black and white areas. However, just clicking the remove chromatic aberrations, as you can see, we'll toggle that. It's easier to see in about this zone here. But if we toggle that on and off, you can see there's a minor difference that takes place. But I wouldn't call that a bad performance for lateral CA. So stopping down to f1.4 does give us a little bit of a boost in contrast. As you can see, our acuity is still not particularly high, however. Mid-frame, you can see contrast is better, but there's still not a lot of really fine details showing up there. Likewise, down in the corner, it's not a bad performance for a corner performance, just still a little bit low on contrast. So how does that compare to the Viltrox 56mm f1.4 at f1.4? So looking in the center of the frame, we can see that first of all, there's not a major difference here. The f1.4 lens is roughly the same. In the mid frame, again, not a significant difference. I think that the Fuji lens has just a slight bit better contrast there, but it's not a meaningful difference. It is better in the corner, however, where you can see that the Viltrox is softer in the corner. So if we stop on down to f2, we can compare it to the Viltrox again, and we can see that at this stage, again, they look more similar than different in the middle of the frame. Viltrox with just a little bit more contrast. In the mid-frame, more similar than different, I would say. Maybe just a slight bit more contrast for the Fuji lens. Down in the corner, the Fuji still has a clear advantage for the corner performance. So how about if we compare the XF 50mm f2 at this point? So we can see, looking in the mid-frame, that I would say that the bigger f1 lens has a little bit better contrast and slightly better detail. The same is true here in the mid-frame, and in the corner it still has a little bit of advantage. Now I have to say that none of these are particularly impressive compared to what I've seen with other lenses. At the same time, however, you can see at least that relative to other lenses, the XF 50mm f1 is a little bit better in performance. So stopping down to f2.8 starts to sharpen things up here towards the corner. You can just see the contrast is picking up some. Looking up in the mid-frame, things are starting to look crisper for sure, and that's true also if we look back towards the center, where you're starting to see a better rendering of fine details. So if we go to a more normal 100% magnification and out into the real world, I just want to show you how this looks. So towards the edge of the frame, not bad, not amazing either in terms of acuity. Towards the middle of the frame, there's details that are there. It's just not like radically crisp like I've seen with some competing lenses on other systems. And so it's okay, but not exceptional. Likewise here, you can see in the center of the frame,
those fine details, they're just not like really crisp. It's only okay. I've definitely seen sharper lenses than this on Fuji, and so it's not like some kind of amazing performance in terms of sharpness, even stop down to f2.8. Stopping on down to f4, you can see just a little bit more contrast and detail, a little bit better here as well. Down in the corner, contrast is a little bit better. It's improving for sure. F5.6, I don't really see a massive difference there. We'll look at the mid frame here quickly. It's maybe mildly better in terms of contrast, but no like radical improvement as you stop the lens down. So again, back into the real world at f5.6. And I have to say it's only okay. It's really, that's not an exceptional amount of detail. I'm not particularly impressed by the acuity of fine details that are just not particularly sharp there. Likewise here, while I like the global look of the image, I'm not impressed at all with the detail that I see there. Again, here I love the look of the image, and I think that the contrast and the detail is a little bit better, but neither is it really fantastic either. And so, there are other advantages that we'll examine from the lens other than sharpness. So as mentioned in our hands-on section, minimum focus is not particularly impressive here. There's not a lot of magnification. And as we're going to see, also we get quite a low performance here, even at that minimum focus distance. This is just not a lens that's optimized for up close. Stopping down a bit obviously helps, and so here at f1.4, we're getting more detail. And if we stop on down to f2 here, the performance is much better. So up close, you're going to get a better performance if you stop down a little bit. One thing I will say is that low distortion and a fairly flat plane of focus may be one advantage of not getting all that close. And so stop down a bit, performance is pretty good. Wide open is pretty miserable. So the reason why you buy an f1 lens is not really because of the sharpness, it's because of the bokeh. And so we can see here that, there is a little bit of the typical deformation towards the edges, coming more like lemon rather than more squeezed. But the bokeh circles are fairly clean here, not really any kind of obvious like onion bokeh, although there's a little bit of a trending towards that, but not too bad. And there is a little bit of fringing on there, as you can see, but again, it's not a terrible amount, not enough to where you're going to really see it much if you're looking at a global level and not at a pixel level. So this shows, this icicle here, the background, there's a bridge back beyond this. Some of you have seen me shoot that scene before. You can see that it really just bleeds away with very little distraction. Very nice. Here, I think this is a beautiful example of how much you can blur a background. Getting fairly close, it's not helped that you really can't get all that close and you don't get great performance up close. But again, looking at the image globally, it looks quite nice. Here too, things look good overall, though the negative here is that you can see a little bit of purple fringing before the plane of focus. The actual bokeh, though, looks quite beautiful. Another example here, you can just see that backgrounds, you're capable of blurring backgrounds out with a, pretty completely. It's just don't expect amazing contrast and detail on your subject at the same time. Here's another example. Again, I like the image globally, and it's okay in terms of contrast and detail, but not exceptional. Here's a couple of similar type images that I really like, but in both cases, I think your bokeh quality is really beautiful. So that's definitely the strength of the lens here. So I noticed an interesting thing, actually by accident, towards the latter part of my review, and that is that if I switched over into shooting JPEGs, I actually was able to get a lot better performance in terms of detail and contrast. The in-camera corrections for JPEGs are really quite good, and so as you can see, these F1 images, they just look a lot better in terms of the amount of detail that's there, in terms of the contrast, the correction of the aberrations. And so if you're a JPEG shooter, ironically, this lens becomes a little more appealing to me. And you can see that it just, even at f1, it's doing a fairly decent job with some of these. Even here at f1, at infinity, you can see that at infinity, it doesn't look all that impressive, even with a JPEG. However, the f5.6 image actually looks a lot better. And so this is a little bit of a challenge for me in that I definitely prefer to shoot RAW because of the editing flexibility. But there's no question that you do get a better end product if you shoot JPEG, because Fuji is really correcting for all of the flaws of the lens really well. And that allowed me even for portraits here at f1. I mean, again, it's not off the charts sharp, but even at f1, that's definitely a useful end result. And colors look nice. Here also stop down to f1.4. You can see that detail is fairly good. The only thing marring the image really is that there is some uncorrected longitudinal chromatic aberrations that are showing up. Another example a little bit closer here, that's definitely just fine. Detail looks good there, and the background is still fairly nice and blurred out. One final shot here, and so you can see for JPEGs, I'm much happier than I am with RAW images.
Despite its size, it's not some kind of, Sigma art ultimately corrected, or Zeiss Otis type lens where you have this pinpoint sharpness from wide apertures, wide open. In this case, we see that, the lens is only reasonably sharp at any point. It's not particularly impressively sharp. And truth be told, I've never yet reviewed a huge maximum aperture lens, f1.1, f1.0, that actually has an amazing optical performance. There's something about this that is like a siren song for photographers, where maybe it's the bragging rights of that huge maximum aperture, kind of like bragging about the horsepower in your car, even though you've never driven it any faster than, 80 miles an hour. And so in this case, I think that maybe is the mentality with a lens like this. We love the idea of an f1 lens, but it's maybe not necessarily the most practical lens for a lot of people. And for those that are on a tighter budget, obviously a lens like the Viltrox 56mm f1.4, it's not nearly as exotic or sexy a lens, but it's going to give you a fairly similar performance. One exception, and I think the bokeh quality from the lens is very good. I also see from those improved JPEG results that if you're really good at processing and getting the most out of your Fuji lenses, you might be able to get a little bit more than what we saw in our chart test. I think that this is going to be a lens that favors the expert. And what I mean by that is not just favors the expert in using it. Not everyone can go out and use an f1 lens well, but also an expert in terms of getting the most out of using the lens to its strengths, number one, but then also maximizing the results of the images through post-processing. Or if you're a JPEG shooter, I think that this lens actually works quite nicely as a JPEG shooter. And so, there are some options there, but clearly this is not a lens for everyone. It's not priced, it's not sized to be one for everyone. But for those of you that really you're more about a certain look and you want what an f1 lens can bring you, I mean, they did achieve something here. I mean, it's an autofocusing f1 lens, and it works fairly well. It just comes with a lot of the typical flaws that I have seen with f1 lenses before. So just bear that in mind. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. You can also find linkage to the image gallery, check out more photos from the lens. And beyond that, of course, there is buying links if you want to purchase one for yourself, links there to follow me on social media, to become a patron and help support this channel, to sign up for my newsletter that comes out every Thursday, and of course beyond that, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube, and be sure to ring that bell to get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Let the light in.